Hey everyone, welcome to Digital BC Livestream. Every month we take this time together to talk to interesting folks who are working to improve services in BC, but also around the world. And my name is Gen Lambert, and I'm the Chief Digital Officer for the province of BC, and I'm joining you today from my home in the beautiful lands of the Wasanich and Lekwungen people who have stewarded these lands from time immemorial. And today, our guest is Lou Downe, and I know there's a lot of people there very excited to see Lou. We've got 300 and more people on live with us today. And Lou is the author of Good Services, the best-selling book on how to design services that work. And Lou is also the founding director of the School of Good Services and the former Director of Design for the UK government, where they founded the discipline of service design in that organization. So welcome, Lou. We're very excited to have you here. All right. So I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for you, Lou, of my own, and then we're going to take questions from the audience, who I'm sure are very excited to be able to ask you some questions directly. And audience, if you want to enter your questions into the chat and upvote the questions that you like the most, and you can also feel free to turn on live captioning. So Lou, your book and your school are both called Good Services. What do you think makes a service good?
That is a very good question with a very long answer. And it's really good to be here, by the way. And it's lovely to, well, I can't see anyone else on this call, but it's lovely to see you all here, everyone who's here. Yeah, I'm giving you virtual waves. Yeah, what makes a good service? Well, there are lots of things that make a good service. There are more commonalities to the things that make a good service than there are things that are different, though. And the reason why I ended up writing the book Good Services is because I started spotting patterns in the things that make good and bad services in lots of different contexts. There was things that pretty much always need that they encounter. So really basic things like being able to find that service, or being able to have their expectations set, or for it to be accessible and inclusive. All of those things are things that every single user needs of every single service. But that is really only just individual users. And I think when we think about the context of what good looks like, we have to think about also whether or not that service delivers the purpose that it was designed to be delivering, and particularly in a public sector context, we have to think about the policy intent that we have that sits behind the service, and whether or not that works for every who needs to interact with that service. And sometimes that can be both helping people to do good things, and sometimes it can be helping people to not do bad things, because public services are quite complicated. So yeah, when it comes to kind of what good looks like, we have to think about everyone who needs to use.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we had some previous guests on that were really talking a lot about accessibility. And I think that you go even further to talk about inclusivity of services. How do you see that those as related, and how would you dig in deeper into the inclusivity?
Yeah, I lost the beginning of that question. I know you asked me about inclusivity there, Jen, but I lost the middle part of it. Could you repeat that?
Oh, sorry. I said that we had some previous guests, and we were speaking to them about accessibility. So I'm just wondering how you see the distinction between accessibility and inclusivity, and how you see folks digging into inclusivity as well in terms of providing services that are inclusive for everyone.
Yeah, really good question. So, I mean, I think when we think about particularly digital public services, what we tend to talk about when we talk about accessibility is making sure that those things work. People who need to use assistive technology to use those services. And whilst that's important to think about people who have permanent physical and cognitive disabilities that, you know, are otherwise excluded from services if we don't consider their needs. There's also a bunch of people who are excluded from our services for other reasons. So I always like to think about inclusivity from the perspective of kind of three different things. So firstly, there's what your user can or can't do. So can they hear, can they read, can they remember things, can they get somewhere physically? Then there are things to do with that person's identity, who they are. So things like their age, their nationality, their background, their sexual orientation, all of these different things to do with that person's identity that may, again, exclude that person if we don't consider their needs. And then the last thing is really the things that they have or don't have access to in their lives. So, you know, do they have a broadband connection? Do they have a printer? Do they have a car, a mobile phone? All of these other things also contribute to whether or not that person can use the service. So I think that's really the kind of horizon that we're dealing with, but we're also thinking beyond just making sure that an individual in the here and now can use this service, but thinking about whether or not it positively or negatively contributes to social inequality. And I think often we don't really think about the data we're collecting, the decision making that we're making, the all of the other tangible and intangible elements of our service that can lead to kind of fair and not. There are lots of examples of where we haven't thought about those things and we've ended up in trouble. So yeah, I think broadening our horizon really to think about those things is very, very important. And remembering, of course, that we will all be excluded from services at some point in our lives for various different reasons. We will all get older, we will all have health difficulties at some point in our lives, and so it's very important to remember that we are not just talking about often what I think of when I hear people talk about this is that they mean a very small group of people. We're talking about a very large group of people who are going to be affected by exclusion, so I think that's important to remember.
Absolutely. And I think as you speak about making sure that we're considering sort of all aspects of a person, we're also looking at making sure that we're helping people along a whole journey, right? I think you have a principle around being agnostic to organizational structure in the delivery of services and really trying to create joined up services. And that really aligns to one of the missions that we have in our digital plan to deliver connected services that don't make people learn how our organization is structured. Could you talk a little bit about how that's difficult and how you've used tactics to overcome those types of difficulties just that organizational silos create?
Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? How do you get rid of the silos? Because we all have them. And yeah, I mean, this is really difficult, and I'm sure that everyone who's listening in today will resonate with the fact that this isn't something that we can change overnight. And particularly when it comes to the structures of government, it's often way outside of our ability to be able to move those structures. So I think part of this is about realizing that that is true and coming to terms with the fact that we have an imperfect system and learning to find ways that we can actually deliver the best possible services in that environment. And often that means finding alternative structures for us to be able to collaborate. I think what we've seen, certainly in the last kind of 5 to 10 years, is organizations bringing in designers, user researchers, digital teams, and tasking them with stitching services up, bringing those silos together. And what happens is, you know, those people end up being the glue themselves. And of course, that glue can only hold for so long. And so what we need to do is to really think about those structures that support those teams. So, you know, communities of practice that are sharing user research and sharing design patterns, or service sharing journey maps and all sorts of other things. Can you still hear me, Jen? Am I breaking up at all?
You are breaking up for me a little bit, but I wasn't sure if that was me or if that was you.
I think it might be me. Do you mind if I just give me like 5 seconds and I go and wiggle the cable?
Sure.
Bear with me. Everyone who's on the call, go and, like, I don't know, get a glass of water or something. Go a sec.
Okay, I was actually debating whether I should move around in my house to try to get some better internet, but it seems like it might not be on my end. But thanks everybody for sending in such good questions. It looks like we've got a lot of them. And thanks, Ari. I hear from my team that my end is good. Okay, so that's great. We've got lots of good questions there, and I see that folks are upvoting as well. So we'll try to get the most questions in that we can in this session, but also, as I'm sure many of you know, we have our podcast that we do when we don't get to all the questions. So I'm sure that that will be needed this time because of all the great questions that are coming in, but also because we're having a little bit of technical difficulty, as sometimes does happen. So thank you for bearing with us.
Okay, the cables have been wiggled. The internet gods have been appeased. Hopefully you can hear me, see me. We'll try. I've closed all of the browser windows. Yeah, so we were talking about silos and negotiating those silos, and I think the thing is to really find the ways of supporting that collaboration, because and I don't know if you've come across Conway's law, but it is the kind of guiding principle to all of this. And for those of you not come across Conway's law before, it's essentially devised by a guy called Melvin Conway, who worked for IBM a little while ago. He's retired now, and he noticed that the quality of his software was directly related to the quality of conversations he was able to have with other people at IBM. And he came up with the term that basically organizations tend to copy the shape of their organization in the services they provide. So if you have like 10 different teams, you'll have 10 separate services. And so Conway's law is in effect, like in our organizations, there's no way of getting around it. But what we can do is to try and alleviate the effects of that by focusing on the quality of those conversations. Because of course, when Mel Conway was working at IBM, back in the kind of 80s and 90s, you had to be in the same team with each other to be in the same building. And, we didn't have all the tools that we now have. So I think thinking about that quality of conversation always kind of, makes me see it differently, I think.
Yeah, I think next time I have a good conversation. I'll think about how we can translate that into the services that we're talking about. I think that's a really good way to sort of appreciate those good conversations that you have as well. So we have now some questions that have come in from the audience. So one of them, and I think this is something that a lot of folks are interested in, is what is the biggest barrier that you've seen to implementing the practice of service design? I know you had to set it up mostly from scratch in the UK government. So how did that go? What was the biggest barrier, and how did you overcome that?
Oh, that's such a good question. Thank you to the person who asked that. I mean, I think the first barrier was an assumption that I think we didn't need it. So I joined Government Digital Service after Gov.uk had been created, and just at the end of a program called the Exemplar program, which was basically a bunch of the kind of the biggest, most high-profile services that were essentially being digitized and put onto Gov.uk. That's a very oversimplified story of it, but essentially the moment that I came in was this moment of great celebration, and we'd managed to achieve so much, which was fantastic. And I felt like someone who was kind of raining on the parade a little bit and saying, well, that's great, but also, how on earth do we help people to actually kind of fulfill the tasks and the things that they have in mind that they're trying to get done? Stuff like starting a business or coming to the UK and staying, and all of those things required you to interact with at least 25 different bits of government to do that. So I think there was a real task in helping people to understand what that meant, and that design went beyond just talking about what things looked like to how they worked and what they were actually aiming to deliver in the first place. So that was a battle. The second battle, I think, was once people understood that, there is also then this kind of golden moment where service design and the person who's talking about service design is seen as the kind of solution to every problem immediately. And so you end up being a bit of a victim of your own success, I think, sometimes. And I know many people have gone through that. And, that's really dangerous, because obviously everyone thinks that service design is just this magical dust that you can sprinkle on everything and it will be much better immediately. And of course, that isn't how it works, unfortunately. So yeah, I think then the task was really about thinking about how we scale this beyond one individual. And that meant pulling together a lot of different sort of disparate products, different services that were existing within GDS, and some new ones to actually support service design and delivery across government, which meant turning what started as a really ranty blog post into a business case. I love blog posts that turn into business cases. They're the best kind. And ultimately getting some significant funding to be able to do that, which was really important. And I don't want to make out like we managed to do all of this stuff without money and time and investment, because we definitely had that, and that was very important.
What kind of leadership supports did you need to have in place in order to put that together? So you mentioned funding, so I'm sure there were some leaders that you worked with other than yourself that needed to support getting the funding. But what else can leaders do to support service design and building and scaling it?
Yeah, great question. I mean, your question reminds me of the moment that I managed to get approval for the business case, in which case it was the head of the civil service at the time, a guy called John Manzoni, who leaned across the table and sort of had this sort of slightly scary look in his eye, and he said, "Well, this all sounds very dangerous, doesn't it? This service design stuff." I've never received such a compliment in my life. It was quite an achievement for someone to kind of be like, "Ooh, this sounds exciting. Excellent. Here you go, have some money." But no, I think the folks who recognized that what I was talking about went well beyond something that, like I said, I joke about it being a ranty blog post. It really genuinely was. And the folks who recognized that was something that we really needed to invest in, I think was really important. And really this comes down to having leaders who have a perspective, who have vision, who want something concrete to happen in the world. And I think that is all too rare sometimes, and it often is something that, having been in many leadership positions myself, it's not encouraged. It's not encouraged for us to have ideas and thoughts and kind of stuff we want to achieve. We're much more encouraged to be much more about how we do things rather than what we do. So I think that is always the kind of number one thing that I think of.
Yeah, that's really interesting to sort of that it's not encouraged to have ideas at the leadership level, and I can definitely see how that is that plays out, and I think encourages us to play it safe sometimes, right, and not take risks and not dig in and sort of put all of our chips in one place. At the same time, without taking on some of those risks and trying new things, then we don't make a lot of progress. So I think it's always a bit of a balance to make those decisions. I guess related to that, we've got a question around how you measure effectiveness. How do you know when that was a good idea and that was a good place to put your chips?
Yeah. I mean, we were constantly having to justify our own existence. So, I mean, in the context of other services, one thing I would say is the most important thing is to actually measure some form of service performance. So many times we see services measuring things like number of calls and number of people who are hitting the website. All of those metrics go off in completely different places. They never come together. We never analyze what they mean. And we certainly don't ever record whether or not we're actually delivering the policy intent that we intended to deliver, which obviously is a difficult cause and effect, if we're looking at road deaths, and there's many things that can contribute to that, for example. So thinking about actually measuring service performance is really important. But going back to, I guess, my context, the kind of the impact of that for us was that one of the products that we were running as part of this kind of services program within Government Digital Service was the performance platform. And the performance platform essentially was a platform to aggregate and share government service performance, because government services don't have shareholders, and they don't have a stock market, and they don't have kind of all of the things that a commercial organization uses to work out whether or not it's doing a good job. So the performance platform was our way of doing that publicly. Ironically, it was very hard to prove the business case of the performance platform. So unfortunately, it did get axed. I would say, I mean, it's very easy for someone to say in retrospect that was a bad thing to do, but it becomes ultimately very difficult to prove the benefit of any service design activity if we don't measure and monitor the performance of those services. So if there's anyone out there who has the capacity to be able to measure and monitor the performance of their services, just do it. You will be able to show all of the benefit that you are making to your service over time, even if there is a really kind of tangential cause and effect relationship between it. It's so important to tell that story.
Mm-hmm. I was reading a little bit about your economics background, that you're married with your art background, and how does that come into play when you're doing measurements and proving the business case for the work?
Yeah, it does a lot. And so much so that now, as part of the school, we focus on supporting those sorts of skills, the skills that I think often people who are in design and user research and kind of digital roles in general, they're not the things that we've been taught. They're not the things that we've studied at university or that we're going to pick up naturally. Writing a business case is just not something that we would know how to do unless we've done it before. And of course, how do you get into the position where you've done it before? Certainly, most people are not in the position I was of writing a ranty blog post and then having it transformed into a business case. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, the reason why I studied economics was because I realized that the language that organizations speak is through money, and unless you can talk in that language, you can talk for as long as you like and no one will listen. And I would love it if organizations kind of cared as deeply about the stories of the struggles that our users have. But when we're dealing with millions of people, billions of pounds worth of budget, and obviously public value, it's really important that we do prove the kind of financials behind those things as well. So it's really important to be able to speak both languages. And I think there's an element of acting as a translator sometimes, actually, that's really important for people in these sorts of user-centered advocacy roles, of being able to say, actually, well, this is really important to users, and this is why it's costing us so much money. And certainly, one of the things that we found was that, in the UK government, we were spending about 60% of the cost of our services on basically unnecessary phone calls and casework. So 60% of the total kind of 80% of government that's spent delivering public services is kind of amounts to probably one of the biggest unnecessary costs for UK taxpayers. And then you start having people paying attention to this long tail of cost that previously is invisible to everyone. So yeah, making that stuff visible is so important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that really makes a lot of sense in terms of it is quite difficult to measure sort of the outcome of our services, and that we are meeting the policy intent. When I moved from the private sector to the public sector, I found that to be one of the things that was most difficult is really measuring the effect of the work that we do, because it's not measured in profit. It's measured in other things. But if you're measuring sort of the efficiencies gained or the cost avoided, it's a little bit easier. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I think we have time now for one more question, and then we will have to probably save all the rest of the questions for the podcast. But one of the folks on the line is asking about your thoughts and experiences related to managing design teams at scale. This organization has 170 plus service designers and UX designers, which is a good position to be in, but always looking for tips on managing that kind of scale.
Yeah, well, I mean, firstly, congratulations to that person for having that number of people in the organization. They're clearly doing something right because, yeah, getting permission to have people doing those roles full-time permanently is not an easy thing. I mean, gosh, I could talk about this for forever. I think one of the most important things is to realize that design teams are more than the sum of their parts. And so as important as those individuals are in the project work that they are doing, they are also a network. And they're a network of people who need to be not only sharing patterns and ways of working, but they also need to share a perspective and a set of ideals and a sense of identity. And that is a real challenge and something that is so, so important. And you don't realize you don't have it until you do, and then you realize the difference. And so we always used to joke that, you know, people who came to work for government digital service and within our, you know, kind of broader design team across government came to work on a black and white website. And because that's what they were excited about. And of course, you know, it's true. They weren't there because they wanted to make, you know, the most exciting, most beautiful, most engaging user experience that they have ever made in their lives. They came because they wanted to make life better for people. They wanted to make things simple. They wanted to reuse components. They wanted to solve problems. They wanted to work together as a team. And so getting people like that to join your team means putting those messages out there, and it means, you know, kind of sharing blog posts, and it means talking about your work and having those public design systems and everything else like that. So that is kind of hugely important. And then I would say, you know, just the other side of this is really about, you know, kind of continuing that team identity through the ability to be able to operate as a team as well. And this is kind of contentious, but it was one thing that I always kind of died in a ditch over, was my ability to be able to line manage all of the design team, or for my team to be able to have line management control of that, because you don't get that kind of network working properly if you have 170 disparate people within an organization who they're not encouraged to talk to each other, they're not incentivized to work together, completely different standards, completely different ways of working, and that's not a team. So yeah, it's a really nerdy point, but a really important one, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we like to be nerdy here, so that's great. Maybe we have time for one like quick last question. I think you've probably gotten a lot of people excited, if they're not already service designers, to look into it more and see if they can add some service design skills to their skill set. What would you say is one thing they could do or one place to start if you're really interested in learning more or adding some service design skills to your quill?
Yeah, good question. I mean, obviously, I would say read the book Good Services, available at all good bookstores. But no, seriously, you can also find those principles for free on the internet. They're available on good.services, and there are a bunch of blog posts about how we define what services are, how products and services work together, how we name our services, all of those sorts of things. The courses that we provide are on GMT, unfortunately, though we're thinking about doing some in different time zones, and we do them privately, obviously, if organizations are kind of interested in doing that. But there is another fantastic book, which I will also recommend, called The Service Organization by Kate Tarling, which I'm sure some people have already read, probably. I know she was a guest on this podcast as well, but that is a fantastic book as well. So yes, you can order the book in North America. You can order it through Amazon, but also other reputable retailers. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, that's great. So I think that's all the time we have today. But this session will be recorded so you can rewatch and share with friends. And thank you so much, Lou. And thanks to the audience for great questions.